Don't scroll past this. Please, stay with me for a moment. My mom called me last night. She said, I'm worried about you. I asked her why. She said, because you haven't been the same since you started listening to him. And honestly, she's right. Something shifted in me. Something quiet but deep. And I don't think I want it to go back. She called it dangerous. My mom actually said, stop listening to him. You're becoming too emotional. But here's what she didn't know. I wasn't just listening for myself. I was listening for her. And when I finally played it for her directly, she couldn't say a single word. There's a moment. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with music or warning or a dramatic sign. It just arrives quietly, like a door closing somewhere deep inside you. And in that moment, something in you already knows, this is it. This is the last time. You've been here before, haven't you? Standing at the edge of something. Not a cliff, not a disaster, just a decision. A silent one. The kind no one around you can see. The kind you don't even put into words, because words would make it too real. So you just carry it. You walk around with it. You smile, you speak, you do the things people expect you to do, and the whole time, that quiet decision is sitting inside your chest like a stone. I want to ask you something, and I need you to stay with this question for a second, not just read past it. Think about the last time you almost walked away from something or someone, and you didn't. You stayed. You gave one more chance, one more conversation, one more try. What made you stay? Was it hope? Or was it fear of what walking away would mean about you? Because most people never ask that. They confuse the two. They think they stayed because they believed. But sometimes, and this is the part that's hard to sit with, sometimes you stayed because leaving felt like losing, and you were never taught how to lose with peace. There is a version of you that is exhausted, not physically. Physically, you are fine. You get up, you keep moving, you do what needs to be done, but something underneath all of that, something that doesn't have a name, is tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. And the strange thing is, you don't talk about it. You don't even fully admit it to yourself. You just keep going, and you get very good at keeping going. And after a while, you can't tell the difference between strength and numbness. This is not a story about giving up. And it is not a story about holding on. It is something harder than both of those things. It is the story of the 1 minute before everything changes. The 1 minute that most people spend looking away from. I'm asking you not to look away. Not yet. There is something that happens to a certain kind of person. Not everyone, just a certain kind. The kind who thinks too much but says too little. The kind who understands things before they are explained and then spends years wondering why no one else seemed to notice. The kind who has always felt, in some quiet and uncomfortable way, that they were built slightly differently from the people around them. Not better, not worse, just differently. And that difference, for most of their life, has felt less like a gift and more like a weight they do not know how to put down. You know this feeling. You have known it for a long time, maybe since you were very young, sitting in a room full of people, and still feeling alone in a way you could not explain. Maybe it came later, in a relationship or a job, or a moment where you looked around and realized that everyone else seemed to be reading from a script you had never been given. And you smiled. You nodded. You played along. Because that is what you learned to do. You learned to perform belonging, even when belonging never quite fit you the way it seemed to fit everyone else. This is not a small thing. This is something that shapes a person from the inside out. When you spend years living slightly outside the version of yourself that the world expects, something inside you starts to quietly fracture. It does not break all at once. It does not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It just slowly and silently cracks, the way old wood cracks in cold weather. You do not hear it happening. You do not feel it in any single moment. But one day you press on something and it gives way, and you realize the damage was building long before you ever noticed it. And here's what nobody talks about. Here's the part that gets left out of every conversation about strength and growth and resilience. The hardest thing is not the pain itself. The hardest thing is the loneliness inside the pain. The fact that you carry something you cannot show. The fact that the very people closest to you have no real idea what is actually happening inside you right now. And the reason they do not know is not because they do not care. It is because you are so good at not showing it. You have become, over time, an expert at being fine, an expert at the daily performance of okay. And performances take energy. That is the part that drains you. Not the problem itself, not the difficulty itself, but the constant effort of standing in front of the world and presenting something you are not fully feeling. There is a tax on that, an invisible, daily tax that no one around you can see you paying. And every morning you get up and you pay it again, and you tell yourself this is just life, this is just how things are, this is what everyone does. But in a part of you that is very honest, you know that is not entirely true. You know there are people who do not feel this weight the way you feel it. People who move through their days without this particular kind of exhaustion, sitting quietly under everything. And there is something in you that is both relieved for them and quietly, privately, envious in a way you would never say out loud. Now I want to stop here for a moment because I want to be clear about something. What I am describing is not self-pity. This is not weakness arriving in a new form. What I am describing is observation, honest observation, the kind that most people avoid because it is uncomfortable to sit with the truth of your own interior life. Most people would rather stay on the surface. They would rather talk about things and people and events, anything that keeps them at a safe distance from the deeper question, which is, who am I really, underneath all the things I do and the face I show and the life I have built? That question is terrifying. Not because the answer is bad, but because the answer requires you to be still. And being still is one of the hardest things a human being can do. We are built for movement. We are built for noise and tasks and forward motion. We treat stillness like a problem to be solved, like emptiness to be filled. But stillness is where truth lives. It is the only place where you can hear what is actually happening inside you. And most people are running very fast from that sound. Think about how you use your time. Think about the actual pace of your days. The way one thing leads immediately to the next without pause. The way silence gets filled almost automatically with sound or screen or conversation or anything that keeps you occupied enough to avoid your own interior. Is it possible that some of that constant movement is not really productivity? Is it possible that some of it is a very human way of avoiding something you do not want to feel? I am not judging that. I have done it. There are rooms inside me that I have kept the lights off in for years. Not because I forgot they were there, because I knew exactly what I would find if I turned the lights on. And there is a very rational, very intelligent argument for leaving certain lights off. Life requires function. It requires you to keep moving, keep building, keep doing. You cannot stop and dig through every dark corner of your psychology every single day. That is not sustainable. But there is a difference between choosing not to go into a room and pretending the room does not exist. One is strategy. The other is a slow, quiet kind of self-destruction. Because the things you do not look at do not disappear. They do not sit quietly and wait politely for a more convenient time. They grow. They find other ways out. They leak into your decisions, your relationships, your reactions, your body. You cannot outrun your own interior life. No amount of speed or achievement or external success can put real distance between you and what you carry inside. And this brings me back to that moment we started with. That specific kind of moment. The 1 minute before everything changes. What makes that minute different from all the other minutes is not what is happening around you. It is what is finally, after all this time, happening inside you. It is the moment when the performance becomes too heavy to hold any longer. When the strategy of not looking no longer works the way it used to. When something in you, something that has been patient and silent for a very long time, quietly decides it is done waiting. That moment is not a breakdown. I want to be very precise about that. It is not weakness arriving. It is honesty arriving. It is the part of you that knows the truth finally getting loud enough to hear over all the noise you have built around it. And the strange irony of that moment is that it usually comes at the worst possible time. When you are most tired. When you have the least room for it. When the world around you is demanding the most from you. Because that is when the walls get thin. That is when the performance starts to slip. And through the cracks, something real and long suppressed begins to come through. You have had this moment. Maybe you are sitting inside it right now. Maybe that is the reason something made you stop and listen today. Not because you needed motivation. You have heard enough motivation. Not because someone told you it gets better. You have heard that too. You stopped because something in the way this began felt true. It felt close. It felt like something you had never quite heard said out loud before, but had been thinking quietly, in the back of a very private mind, for longer than you want to admit. And right now, in this 1 minute, I want you to do just one thing. Not fix anything, not decide anything, not reach for a solution or a lesson. Just sit with the fact that something in you has been waiting to be seen. Not by anyone else, just by you. Because the deepest kind of loneliness is not the absence of other people. It is the long, quiet distance you have placed between yourself and your own truth. That is what this is really about. That is where this begins. Not with answers, just with the willingness to stay in the discomfort a little longer than feels safe. You are still here. That already says something. I am not sure you fully know yet what it says. But somewhere in you, quiet and patient, a part of you knows. And that part has been waiting for you to stop long enough to finally listen. There is a kind of listening that most people have never really done. Not the kind where you wait for someone to finish so you can respond. Not the kind where you hear words while your mind is already building its next thought. I mean the other kind. The kind where you go completely still and you listen to yourself. Where you sit in a room alone with no noise to fill the surface of your attention, and you simply wait for whatever is actually there to come forward. Most people cannot hold that silence for more than a few minutes. Something in them reaches for the phone, for a task, for background sound, for anything that interrupts the quiet before it gets too real. And I understand that. Silence is not empty. Silence is not neutral. Silence is exactly where everything you have been moving away from actually lives. And the moment you stop producing noise, it starts to speak. And what it says is not always what you want to hear. What I said before was this. The deepest loneliness is the distance you have placed between yourself and your own truth. I want to stay inside that for a while longer, because most people feel something like that for a second and then file it away. They register it as meaningful and then they move on. But they do not stop and ask the harder question, which is, what is the truth I have been keeping at a distance? What is it that I know somewhere underneath all the movement and noise that I have been quietly choosing not to face? Here is something I have come to understand about human beings. We are not primarily rational. We like to believe we are. We like to think that our decisions are built on logic and evidence and careful thought. But most of what actually drives us is happening in places we cannot see directly. Most of what shapes our reactions, our choices, our relationships, all of it is below the surface. And the dangerous thing is not that this is true. The dangerous thing is that we convince ourselves it is not. We build a version of ourselves that only includes the parts we are comfortable with, and we present that version to the world, and after long enough, we start to believe it completely. This is not dishonesty in the simple sense. It is something more layered than that. From a very young age, you learned which parts of yourself brought warmth and which parts brought distance. You learned what version of you received approval and what version of you made people uncomfortable. And you adapted, naturally, quickly, with very little conscious thought. You shaped yourself around what the world rewarded, and you did it so early and so completely that you eventually stopped noticing you were doing it at all. But the parts of you that were hidden did not disappear. They went somewhere below the visible life you built. And over the years, those parts developed their own kind of pressure, like water behind a wall. You cannot always see the wall from the outside. It looks fine, it looks solid, but the pressure has been building for a long time, and pressure always finds a way out. If not through a door you choose, then through cracks you did not plan for. That is not a warning, that is just what pressure does. It seeks release. And if you do not give it a conscious and honest release, it will find its own way through. You see it in the tiredness that has no physical cause, in the low, constant hum of something being not quite right, even when the surface of your life looks completely fine. In the sudden reaction that surprises even you. In the dreams that leave a feeling but no story. In the quiet moments of distance that arrive when you least expect them and disappear before you can examine them closely. You know what I am talking about. Not because this is unusual, because this is deeply, quietly human. And it feels familiar because you have been living inside it for a very long time. You have been navigating around it so long that you no longer feel the navigation happening. It just feels like the natural shape of your life. It just feels like how things have always been, and how they will probably continue to be. The question is not only what you are carrying. The question is why you continue to carry it at a distance. Why you keep a certain space between yourself and the clearest version of what is true. Because underneath the avoidance, underneath the pace and fullness of your days, there is always a belief, a quiet, governing belief about what you would find if you turned and looked directly. And that belief is almost always more frightening than the actual thing itself. This is one of the strangest features of the mind. We are often more afraid of the knowing than the not knowing. We tell ourselves we are afraid of what we might find, but what we are really afraid of is what we would be required to do with what we find. Because knowing something clearly changes you. Once you have seen something directly, you cannot unsee it. And that means you carry a new kind of responsibility. A responsibility to choose differently. To let go of something that has been familiar for so long that even when it hurts, it still feels like home. Home is not always safe. That is the part that is hard to absorb. Home is not always good for you. Home is just what you have grown accustomed to. Home is the particular shape of the struggle that has become so familiar, it no longer registers as struggle. The patterns of thought that return to you reliably, like worn furniture in a room you have lived in for years without really seeing. Familiarity and safety are not the same thing, but the mind treats them as though they are. The mind will choose what it knows over what is better for it, almost every time, unless something stops the automatic reach and creates a real pause. That pause is what is happening right now. Not through force, not through urgency, just through a quiet kind of honesty. The kind that does not require you to take any immediate action, to reach for any resolution, to decide anything today. Just the kind that asks you to be still, for once, and let what is true be true, without immediately covering it with something else, without the familiar explanation that makes it smaller and more manageable. I think you arrived here today carrying something specific. I do not know its shape. I do not know its name. But I think some part of you recognized something when this began. Not a new idea. Not something you had never considered. Something older than that. Something you have thought in private, in the quiet after everyone else is asleep. In the few honest minutes that come before you have fully assembled your daily performance of okay. And what you recognized was the sound of that private thought finally being spoken out loud, in a register that matched what it actually felt like inside you. That is a rare thing. Most of the world is very loud. Most of what reaches you is surface, is noise, is information dressed as meaning. And you have gotten very good at filtering it, good at consuming it without being truly touched by it. But something about this touched something, and that is worth staying inside. Not analyzing it immediately, not translating it into a plan or a next step or a lesson to carry forward. Just staying inside it. Letting it be what it is without rushing it towards something useful. Because the thing you've been carrying is not a problem to be solved. It is a truth to be seen. And there is a very important difference between those two things. Solving implies there is something wrong that needs correcting. Seeing implies there is something real that simply deserves to be acknowledged. And what you carry is not a flaw. It is not evidence of failure. It is just something that has never been fully, quietly, honestly seen, not even by you. You are still here. The silence is still open, and there is more in it, far more than you have ever allowed yourself to actually hear. The question is not whether it is there. The question is whether you are willing to stay long enough for it to speak at a level you cannot talk yourself out of. There is a version of fear that most people recognize, the sudden kind, the kind that comes with a physical feeling, with a racing heart and a sharp intake of breath, and a clear source you can point to. That kind of fear is manageable. That kind of fear is honest. It arrives, it is felt, it passes. The body knows what to do with it. The mind knows how to name it. But there is another kind, a slower kind, a kind that does not announce itself with any physical signal, and does not come from any clear and obvious source. It is more like a temperature than a sound, something that is simply present in the background of everything, slightly adjusting the quality of each moment, without ever declaring itself directly. You do not walk around feeling afraid. You just walk around feeling slightly guarded, slightly closed, slightly reluctant in a way that is very hard to name and almost impossible to explain to anyone else. This kind of fear is the one that does the most damage. Not because it is more intense than the sharp kind, but because it is invisible. It operates below the level of your conscious attention. It shapes your choices without ever showing up clearly enough for you to challenge it. You do not make decisions from this fear. You make decisions that simply feel logical, that simply feel practical, that simply feel like the reasonable and adult thing to do. And underneath all that reasonable and practical and adult thinking, this quiet fear is the actual thing pulling the strings. What is it afraid of exactly? That is the question I want to sit inside for a while. Because if you can understand what this particular fear is actually protecting you from, everything else starts to make a different kind of sense. This fear is not afraid of pain. You have already lived through pain. You have already survived things that should have broken you and did not. You know your own resilience in a way that most people never test. So it is not pain that this fear is guarding against. What it is guarding against is something more specific than pain. It is guarding against exposure, not the physical kind, the interior kind. The fear of being fully seen. The fear that if someone, or if you yourself, look directly and clearly at what is actually happening inside you, at all of it, without the careful framing and the managed presentation, something would be found there that would confirm the very thing you have been quietly afraid of for a very long time. That underneath the capability and the control and the forward motion, there is something fragile, something uncertain, something that does not yet have an answer. And here is the painful twist in this. The very act of protecting yourself from that exposure requires enormous energy. The constant management of what is visible, the careful tending of the surface, the low-level vigilance that never fully turns off, even in your most private moments. You are always, on some level, performing, even alone, even in silence, because the habit of self-presentation gets so deep over time that it no longer feels like performance. It just feels like how you are. And you begin to lose track of where the performance ends and where the actual you begins. This is not a crisis. I want to be clear about that. This is not a sign that something has gone terribly wrong. This is what happens to thoughtful, sensitive, deeply aware people who grew up in environments that did not always feel entirely safe for the fullest version of them. And nearly everyone grew up in some version of that environment. The world is not designed to hold full, complex, unmanaged human beings. It is designed for function, for productivity, for the presentation of an acceptable and useful self. And you adapted to that design. You adapted brilliantly, actually. The person you built to survive is impressive. It works. It moves through the world effectively. But it is exhausting to be, and you know that. In the private moments, in the quiet after the world has asked everything it is going to ask of you for the day and you finally have a moment with no demands on your attention. In that space, there is sometimes a feeling that is almost grief. Not grief for anything specific, just a kind of ache, a heaviness, something that sits in the chest without explanation and does not respond to reason or distraction the way other things do. Grief is often about loss, but the grief I am describing is sometimes about something you have never yet had, something you do not even have a clear name for, a version of your life where you did not have to manage yourself so carefully, a version of yourself that did not require constant upkeep, a way of existing that felt more native, more honest, more aligned with something deep and wordless that has been quietly waiting beneath the constructed life you have spent years building. This is where control becomes interesting, because most of the things we think of as control are actually responses to this particular fear. The more deeply a person is afraid of being seen, the more they fear the exposure of their own interior fragility, the more they reach for control in the external world. If I can control my environment, my output, my presentation, my results, then I never have to confront the thing I cannot control, which is what is true inside me. External control is a very effective way of avoiding internal honesty, and it works, up to a point. The point where it no longer works is exactly the kind of moment we started inside at the beginning of this. There is a specific kind of intelligence that makes this pattern more intense. Certain minds are very good at analysis, very good at seeing the shape of a situation clearly and quickly, very good at identifying what needs to happen and executing it with precision. And that same analytical power, that same sharpness of mind, can be pointed inward. And when it turns inward, without honesty, without willingness, it becomes something that works against you. It builds better arguments for why the thing you are avoiding does not need to be looked at. It constructs more sophisticated reasons for why the performance is actually fine, why the distance you keep from yourself is actually wisdom, why what you call control is actually just being careful and responsible and focused. The mind is very loyal to its own comfort. It will use your greatest strengths in the service of keeping you exactly where you are. And if you are a person of genuine capability, it will use all of that capability to maintain the familiar, to protect the structure, to justify the avoidance with impressive and airtight reasoning. And you will believe it, because you have learned to trust that mind. Because that mind has solved real problems, has navigated real complexity, has delivered real results. You do not have a habit of questioning it, you have a habit of listening to it. But there is something below the mind, below the analysis, below the architecture of thought and reason that you have built and refined and relied on. Something that is not impressed by the reasoning. Something that does not respond to being out-argued. It just persists. Quietly, consistently, without urgency. Like a low sound that continues beneath all the other sounds, waiting for a moment of true silence to be heard. You have been close to that silence today. You have been sitting in the vicinity of something that does not usually get this much of your honest attention. And there is a feeling in that something uncomfortable, yes, but also something that has a different quality underneath the discomfort. Something that almost feels like relief. Like the particular kind of relief that comes not from a problem being solved, but from a truth finally being acknowledged, even partially, even quietly, even without any resolution in sight. The 1 minute before everything changes is not a minute of action. It is a minute of finally, softly, staying still long enough for the thing you have been circling around to have room to exist. You have not walked away yet, and that still says something. Something quiet and patient and significant that you are not quite ready to name yet. There is something significant about the fact that you are still here. Not in a dramatic sense, not in the way that gets turned into a moment of celebration or triumph, just in the simple, honest sense that you have stayed inside something uncomfortable, without reaching for the nearest exit. And that is rarer than it sounds. Most people exit long before they reach anything real. Most people manage to stay comfortable enough, distracted enough, busy enough, that they never have to sit inside the kind of quiet you are sitting inside right now. The thing you have not yet named, the thing that is significant and quiet and patient, I want to approach it slowly, not because it needs to be protected, but because the mind has a reflex. The moment something gets named too quickly, too neatly, the mind files it away. It gets categorized. It gets placed on a shelf with a label. And once something is labeled, it stops being alive. It stops pressing. It becomes something you have addressed rather than something you are actually sitting inside. And I do not want that to happen yet. Because the pressure of the unnamed thing is doing something important. It is keeping you honest in a way that a neat label would not. So instead of naming it, let me describe its shape. It is the feeling that something about the life you are living and something about the person you actually are have not yet fully met. That there is still a gap between the life that is visible, the one you manage and present and maintain, and the life that is felt. The interior one, the one that moves according to a different logic, the one that reacts to things the visible life would never acknowledge. The one that knows things the managed self would prefer not to know. This gap is not unique to you, but the way it is experienced is different for different people. For some, it is a low and constant sense of being slightly out of place, even in the most familiar settings. For others, it is a recurring feeling that something important is being missed, that life is moving at speed, but the meaning of it is somehow not quite landing. For others still, it is the strange hollowness that arrives after achieving something significant. That moment when you reach the thing you work toward and find, in the very instant of reaching it, that the feeling you expected is not quite there. That the arrival does not feel the way the journey promised it would. That what you were certain would feel like completion instead feels strangely like the beginning of a new version of the same quiet emptiness. That last experience, the hollowness after achievement, I want to stay inside that for a moment, because it is one of the most psychologically interesting and least talked about experiences a driven person can have. You work towards something. You hold it as a target. You organize enormous amounts of energy and focus around it, and somewhere in the back of your mind, connected to that target, is a feeling you have already attached to it. A feeling of being finally, fully okay. Of the low hum of incompleteness going quiet. Of the thing you cannot name being satisfied by the arrival of this one external result. And then you arrive. And the result is real. The achievement is real. And the feeling, the one you attach to it, is not there the way you thought it would be, or it is there briefly, a surface warmth that fades faster than it should, and then the hum returns. The incompleteness returns. And something in you registers this gap between what you expected to feel and what you actually feel. And you do one of two things. Either you decide the target was not large enough and you need a bigger one, or you stop thinking about it very quickly and move forward to the next thing. Both of those responses are avoidance. They are different paths to the same destination, which is the continuation of movement and the continuation of the distance between yourself and the actual source of the unnamed incompleteness. And the more practiced you become at those two responses, the less you notice them as choices. They become invisible strategies. They become the natural texture of how you move through both success and disappointment alike, until you can no longer clearly feel the difference between the two. Because the truth, and this is the part that is genuinely hard to stay with, the truth is that no external achievement has ever, in the entire history of human beings, fully solved an internal need. The mind knows this. At some level, the deepest and most honest part of you already knows this. But the strategy of reaching for external results in response to internal hunger is so deeply embedded in how most people function that it operates automatically, almost entirely beneath conscious choice. You are not deliberately and knowingly choosing to look for external solutions to internal questions. It just happens. The way reaching happens. The way the hand moves to the phone before the mind has decided to reach for it. It is a pattern that was built long before you had the awareness to question whether it was actually serving you. And this automatic reaching is not a character flaw. It is the result of very early learning. From the very beginning, you were given external signals to navigate by. You were taught that certain results meant you were okay, and others meant you were not. You were shaped to read the temperature of your own worth from the outside in, from approval, from achievement, from the reactions of the people around you. And you were never, or almost never, given the opposite education, the one that teaches you to navigate from the inside out. The one that asks not what you achieved today, but what you actually felt, what you actually needed, what was quietly true for you underneath all the external results. So you grew into a person of impressive external navigation, with very little practice in internal navigation. You know how to read a room. You know how to read people. You know how to assess a situation clearly and respond with precision. But sitting alone in silence, reading yourself honestly, without filtering or framing, that skill was never fully developed. Not because you are incapable of it, but because you were never required to develop it. The external world rewarded the external skills, and you went where the reward was. That is not failure. That is simply the logic of how learning works. There is a specific weight in being the capable one. It is the weight of all the moments you showed up fully for something or someone, and no one thought to ask how you were doing. The weight of all the times you gave something real and received something surface in return. Not because the people around you are indifferent, not because you are owed anything. Just because the version of you that the world has always seen is the version that does not appear to need anything. And when you do not appear to need anything, people stop offering. And then you learn, slowly and without deciding to stop asking. And that distance becomes a habit, and the habit becomes invisible, and eventually it simply becomes what you call how things are. But there is a cost that comes due. You cannot truly connect with anyone, not a person, not a purpose, not even yourself, from the outside of yourself. Real connection requires an interior meeting. It requires the thing being offered and the thing inside you actually touch. And if you have spent years maintaining a careful distance from your own interior, that meeting cannot happen at the depth it needs to. You can have the form of connection, the language of it, the gestures of it, the external shape of it, but the actual feeling of it, the real and grounding sense of being genuinely met, requires a level of interior access that most people have never fully allowed themselves. You have been waiting for that longer than you have admitted to yourself. And the question is not whether you deserve it. The question is whether you are willing to stop long enough and be honest enough with yourself for it to finally arrive. Because it will not come through the noise. It does not live inside the performance. It is somewhere much quieter than anywhere you have allowed yourself to be in a very long time. And you are not finished yet with learning what that means. There is a particular kind of waiting that does not feel like waiting. It does not feel like patience or hope or anticipation. It feels more like absence, like a space that you have stopped expecting to be filled. Not because you no longer need it to be filled, but because you have waited long enough that the need itself started to feel like a problem. and you are very good at solving problems. So you solved this one the only way you knew how. You made the need smaller. You pushed it further back. You told yourself a quieter version of your life was still a full one. And you believed it, mostly. Almost entirely. Except in the moments when you did not. Those moments, the ones when you did not believe it, I want to talk about those. Because those are the moments that matter most, and they are also the moments that get the least attention. They come and go so quickly, and you have become so skilled at moving through them without stopping, that by the time you have put a few minutes between yourself and the feeling, it is already becoming a story, already becoming something you are narrating, rather than something you are inside. And the narration is safe. The narration has a shape and a distance. But the feeling itself, in the actual moment of it, before the mind arrives with its explanation, that feeling is something else entirely. Try to stay inside one of those moments. A real one. Not a constructed memory you have already processed and organized. A raw one. The moment you felt something and almost did not catch it in time, before the familiar machinery of getting on with things arrived and covered it. What was actually in that moment? What was underneath the feeling, before the explanation? There is usually something very simple in there, not complex, not sophisticated. Just something very human and very quiet that did not need analysis. It needed only to be felt, and it was not. Not fully. Not with the kind of honest attention it was asking for. This is where awareness becomes its own kind of difficulty, because there are two kinds of awareness. There is the awareness that observes from a distance, that watches what is happening from a controlled and slightly removed position, always maintaining the clarity of the observer rather than the vulnerability of the participant. And then there is the other kind, the kind that fully enters what is being felt, that does not stand apart from it and describe it, but actually moves inside it and allows it to be what it is without immediately framing it as information, without immediately turning it into something useful or manageable or understood. The first kind of awareness you are very good at. You have developed it over years of necessary self-management. It is a useful skill. It protects you. It keeps you functional in situations that would otherwise be overwhelming. But it has a shadow side. The shadow of always watching yourself means you are never quite fully living inside the moment. You are always, at some level, the observer of your own experience, rather than the full inhabitant of it. And over time, that habit creates a very specific kind of inner distance, a distance from your own life, a feeling that things are happening to someone very close to you, someone you know very well, but that the full and unmediated feeling of it is somehow always slightly out of reach. This is not dissociation in any dramatic or clinical sense. It is something far more ordinary and far more widespread than that. It is just what happens when a person spends years learning to manage their interior rather than simply live inside it. The management keeps things running, but it also keeps you at arm's length from the depth of your own experience. And depth is where meaning lives. Surface experience is fine. Surface experience keeps you moving. But meaning, the actual sense that your life is yours, that it is being genuinely felt and not just successfully navigated, that requires depth. And depth requires the willingness to stop managing for long enough to simply be. Here is something true about silence. Real silence. Not just the absence of external noise, but the actual interior kind where the self-management pauses, and the observation pauses, and the narration pauses. Real silence is something most people have never fully experienced. Because even when the external world is quiet, the internal world keeps running. The reviewing of conversations, the planning of tomorrow, the low background monitoring of how things are going and what needs to happen and how you are being perceived and what still needs to be addressed. This continuous inner noise is so constant and so automatic that people forget it is noise. They think it is just thought. They think it is just what minds do. But it is not. It is a specific and habitual way of using the mind that keeps you continuously on the surface of yourself, continuously in the management layer, and almost never in the deeper place where something different becomes possible. What lives in that deeper place is not dramatic. It is not a revelation waiting to unfold. It is not the answer to every question you have ever had. It is something much simpler and much harder to accept than any of those things. What lives in that deeper place is just what is actually true right now, not processed, not improved, not arranged into something that makes sense from the outside, just true. And the reason most people cannot go there easily is not because it is frightening, though sometimes it is. It is because what is true right now is often incomplete, unresolved, without direction, and the mind is deeply uncomfortable with incompleteness. The mind wants to arrive somewhere. It wants the narrative to have a shape, the feeling to have a cause, the awareness to have a conclusion. But what you are carrying does not have a clean conclusion. What you have been sitting inside since this began does not resolve into a simple and satisfying understanding. It just is. It just exists, with all its complexity and contradiction and open edges. And learning to sit inside that, learning to be with what is true without immediately needing it to go somewhere or mean something definitive, that is one of the hardest and most honest things a human being can attempt. The reason it matters is this: you cannot make a real decision from a distance. You cannot choose your life clearly from the management layer. You cannot understand what you actually want, what you actually need, what is actually working and what is not. You cannot see any of those things clearly from the surface. The surface is efficient, but clarity lives deeper, and clarity is what you are hungry for, even if that hunger has been quiet for so long that you have almost stopped recognizing it as hunger. Think about the last real decision you made. Not a practical one, not a logistical one, a real one. One that was about the direction of something that matters to you. How did it feel to make it? Did it feel like it came from somewhere deep and honest inside you? Or did it feel like the logical conclusion of external circumstances? Did it feel like a choice? Or did it feel like the next step in a sequence that had already been decided by everything that came before it? Because there is an enormous difference between those two things. And that difference is exactly the difference between a life that is being lived and a life that is being managed. You are somewhere in between those two things right now. You have not fully given your life over to management. Something in you still resists that. Something still keeps one door open to the deeper room, even when you have not walked through it in a long time. That is what brought you here. That is what kept you listening, when the easier thing would have been to stop. That open door, that persistent and unclosed part of you that is still waiting for something more honest than the surface has ever been able to give you. It has been waiting patiently, more patiently than you perhaps deserve. And it has not given up on you, even when you gave it very little attention. Even when you chose the noise over the silence and the management over the honest feeling. It stayed open. That door stayed open, and you are standing closer to it right now than you have been in a very long time. That is not nothing. That is not a small thing at all. There is a specific moment in human awareness that almost no one talks about. It is the moment you realize that the version of yourself you have been living as is not the only version available to you. Not the moment after that realization, not the action, not the decision, not the change, just the moment of the realization itself. The brief, still, almost wordless instant when something shifts in your understanding of your own interior landscape, and you see, not with your eyes but with something deeper, that you have been living inside a smaller room than the house you actually are. That moment does not feel like freedom. Not yet. It feels first like disorientation. Because everything that has been familiar, every habit of thought and movement and self-presentation that you have built your daily life around, suddenly has a slightly different quality. Not wrong, not bad, just smaller than you thought it was. And there is grief in that. A very quiet, very personal grief that does not have a ceremony or a name but is real in the way that only privately felt things are real. The grief of time already spent inside something too small. The grief of all the moments when the deeper thing was available and you reached for the surface instead. Not out of laziness, not out of weakness, but simply because the surface was what you knew how to do. I want to say something about grief because it is one of the most misunderstood experiences in a human life. Most people think of grief as the response to loss, and it is that, but it is also the response to recognition, to the moment of seeing clearly what has been true without your awareness of it. Grief is not only backward-looking, sometimes it arrives in a moment of sudden clarity about the present, about the gap between where you are and where something in you has always been quietly reaching toward. And that kind of grief is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that something in you is honest enough to feel the distance accurately without flinching away from it. The flinching is what usually happens. The mind arrives quickly with something to soften the feeling, a rationalization, a redirect, a reminder of all the things that are good and working and fine. And those things are real. The good things are real. The working things are real. But the reality does not erase the other reality. Both things can be true at the same time. Your life can be functional and even genuinely good in many of its visible parts, and still contain a quiet and persistent ache for something it has not yet fully reached. Those two truths do not cancel each other out. They exist together, in the same interior space, and learning to hold both of them without needing to resolve the tension between them is one of the most honest things a person can practice. Most people cannot hold that tension. It is too uncomfortable. The mind wants resolution. The mind wants one of the two truths to win, to become the official version of how things are. So either the good things become the whole story, you focus on what is working, you practice gratitude, you remind yourself of the evidence for okay, or the ache becomes the whole story. You let it color everything. You use it to explain your dissatisfaction. You make it your identity. Both of those are exits. Both of those are ways of avoiding the actual experience of sitting inside both truths simultaneously, without letting either one erase the other. The ability to sit inside contradiction is one of the quietest forms of real strength. Not the strength that performs, not the strength that pushes through and powers forward and refuses to show difficulty. The other kind. The kind that can be in uncertainty without forcing an early exit. The kind that can feel something clearly and not immediately reach to fix or explain or transform it. The kind that can look directly at the parts of life and self that are unresolved and simply stay with them, present and honest, without requiring them to be anything other than what they are. You've not always had access to that kind of strength. Very few people do, early in their lives. It develops slowly, and usually through difficulty, and usually in ways that do not feel like development while they are happening. Most of what makes a person deeper and more genuinely capable of honest self-awareness comes through the experiences they would never have chosen, through the moments of real loss, real failure, real exposure, through the times when the management strategy broke down and something uncontrolled came through, regardless of your preference, through the cracks, always through the cracks, never through the solid and managed surface. This is the strange thing that the hardest moments carry. Not a lesson, exactly, not a silver lining in any simple sense, but a forced intimacy with your own interior that the smooth and managed periods of life almost never provide. When everything is working, when the surface holds, when the performance is successful and the results are arriving, and the external world is confirming that you are okay, in those periods, you can go for a very long time without ever being required to go deeper. And most people do. They take the smoothness and run with it and tell themselves, this is the goal. This is what we work toward. This is what it means to have things under control. And they lose access, slowly and without noticing, to the deeper room. The difficult moments break that smooth surface, and the breaking is painful. But in the breaking, something becomes available that was not available before. A kind of honest access to yourself that the managed life cannot provide. A way of knowing your own interior that comes not from analysis but from actual undefended contact. And this is not something you can manufacture. You cannot decide to go deeper through an act of will when everything is fine. The depth is only available when the surface has been genuinely disrupted. Not because life is cruel, but because depth requires real stakes. It requires the thing you are sitting inside to actually matter to you. And the things that matter most have a way of finding the parts of you that are least defended. You are in one of those moments now, not a catastrophe, not a breakdown, just a genuine disruption of the surface. A moment when the usual noise is quieter than it normally is, and the usual movement has slowed enough for something underneath to become slightly more audible. And that thing underneath is not asking for a decision, it is not asking for a plan, it is asking only for honest attention, just the willingness to look at it directly, for long enough, without the immediate reach for the explanation or the solution or the next thing. The 1 minute before everything changes, that is where you still are, still inside it, still in the minute before. And there is something important about the before, because the after is not what it seems from this position. From inside the minute before, the after looks like resolution, like the clarity that arrives once the difficult moment has passed. But the real change is not in the after. The real change is in what happens inside the before, in what you are willing to see while you are still inside the difficulty, before it has resolved, before the mind has had time to arrive with its comfortable narrative about what it all meant. What you are willing to see right now, in this unresolved and quietly uncomfortable place, that is the thing that will actually change something. Not the arrival at understanding, the willingness, right here, to stay honest inside the not yet understanding. You have been closer to yourself in these last few moments than you may have been in a very long time. And there is something still ahead. Something that does not resolve what has been opened here, but that changes the quality of how it is carried going forward. Something that you have not quite reached yet, but you are moving toward it, quietly, without performance, without anyone watching. Just you and the truth, and the rare and genuinely significant act of continuing to stay inside something real rather than choosing the familiar comfort of looking away. That is not a small thing. And somewhere in the part of you that has been waiting the longest, something has recognized this moment. Something that does not speak in words. Something that simply registers the honesty of right now and holds it in a place where it will not be forgotten. Even when the noise returns, even when the surface closes over again, and the days go back to their usual pace. It is already inside you now, and it will not disappear. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes after something has shifted, not after it has resolved, not after it has been fixed or understood or concluded, just after something has moved, after something that was in one position inside you has, slowly and without announcing itself, moved into a slightly different position. And the quiet that follows that movement is different from the quiet that came before it. The earlier quiet was the quiet of waiting. This quiet is something else. It is the quiet of something having been genuinely touched. You feel it differently than you expected. Not as relief exactly. Not as clarity in the sharp and sudden sense. More like the specific feeling of a room after the windows have been opened for the first time in a long season. The air is the same air. The room is the same room. But something in the quality of it has changed. Something that was stale, without you ever quite noticing its staleness, is now slightly different. And you breathe in a way you have not breathed in a while, without knowing you had stopped breathing that way. This is not a resolution. I want to be very clear about that, because the mind is very eager at this point to declare a resolution. It has been sitting inside difficulty, and it wants to believe that something has been solved. It wants to turn what has happened here into a lesson that can be packaged and carried forward and referenced in future moments of need. And that impulse is understandable. That is just how minds work. They want to convert experience into knowledge. They want to make the formless thing into something with a shape and a use. But what has happened here is not a lesson. It is something older than lessons. It is just contact, real contact, between you and something in yourself that has been asking for this for a very long time. And contact does not produce a lesson. Contact produces a change in the texture of how you inhabit yourself. A change so subtle that you might not be able to describe it to anyone. But real in the way that only interior things are real. The way that the most significant things in a human life are almost never the visible ones. Think about what actually stays with you over the course of a life. Not the achievements, not the results, not the moments of external recognition. What actually stays, what actually remains living in the interior after everything else has faded, are the moments of genuine contact. The moments when something real passed between you and another person, or between you and a piece of truth, or between you and your own most honest self. Those moments do not need to be dramatic. They are often very quiet. They often happen without ceremony, without announcement, without anything in the external world shifting at all. But inside something moves, and the movement leaves a mark that no amount of time or noise or management fully erases. This moment is one of those. Even if you cannot fully feel that from inside it. Even if from the inside it simply feels like a quiet and slightly uncomfortable and unresolved experience of being more honest with yourself than usual. That is enough. That is actually exactly enough. Because the standard is not transformation. The standard is not breakthrough. The standard is just honesty. Real, unmanaged, unframed honesty. And you have been inside that today, perhaps for longer than you have allowed yourself, in a very long time. There is something that happens to a person who has spent years maintaining a careful management of their interior life, and then finally, even briefly, allows that management to soften. It is not explosion. It is not the dramatic release that the word breakdown implies. It is something much quieter. It is almost like a held breath finally being let go. And in the letting go, a kind of tiredness arrives. Not the bad kind, the other kind. The kind that comes after something has been held for a very long time, and is now, just for this moment, being set down. You've been holding something for a very long time. Not one specific thing, a whole collection of quietly held things. The unnamed ache. The gap between visible life and interior life. The distance between who you appear to be and who you are in the honest private moments. The unspoken questions, the unfelt feelings, the unacknowledged grief of moments that pass without being fully inhabited. All of it has been held in that careful and practiced management, day after day, year after year, with the competence and efficiency of someone who learned very early that holding was necessary and that setting down was not safe. And safety is the word I want to stop at for a moment. Because underneath almost everything we have moved through together, that is the word that lives at the center. Safety. The primary question at the deepest part of a human being is always, continuously, below all other questions asking. Not am I successful, not am I loved in the abstract, but am I safe? Is it safe to be what I actually am? Is it safe to feel what I actually feel? Is it safe to not know the answer? Is it safe to be uncertain and incomplete and unresolved without that incompleteness being used against me? For many people, the answer they received early in life to that question was conditional. You are safe if you perform correctly. You are safe if you manage your presentation. You are safe if you are useful, if you are capable, if you are okay even when you are not okay. Safety was attached to function. And so the deepest self, the one that does not always function perfectly, the one that sometimes does not know, the one that sometimes simply needs without being able to give anything in return, that self learned that it was not the safe one to show. And here you are, many years later, having built an impressive and functional life on top of that early learning, having become genuinely capable in ways that go far beyond what was required for simple safety. And yet the original agreement's still running, somewhere very deep, in a part of the system that the adult intelligence almost never reaches directly. The agreement that says, stay managed, stay functional, stay in control, stay on the surface, because that is where it is safe to be. But the surface is getting thinner. That is what this moment has been about, not in a catastrophic sense, just in the honest sense that the effort of continuous surface maintenance has a cumulative cost, and that cost has been building in ways that even your considerable capacity for forward motion has not fully been able to outpace. Something has been asking, with increasing persistence, for something more than the surface can provide, and today, for reasons you may not be entirely able to explain, you stopped long enough to let it speak. And what it said was not complicated. It was not eloquent. It did not arrive in the language of philosophy or psychology or any constructed framework for understanding the self. It was something much more simple than all of that. Something that, if you stay very still right now and let the noise of thinking quiet down for just a moment, you can still feel the echo of something that does not need to be understood to be true. Something that does not need to arrive at any conclusion to be worth feeling. There is a part of you that is not tired, under all of it, under the held things and the managed things and the long effort of the surface. There is something in you that has not been diminished by any of it. Something that has waded through all of the noise and the performance and the continuous forward motion without losing its quality. Something quiet and persistent, and essentially yours that nothing external has ever actually touched. You have felt it before, in the rarest and most honest moments. It is not hope in the simple sense. It is not strength in the performing sense. It is something more fundamental than either of those things. Something that was there before you learned to manage it. Before you learned what was safe to show. Before the construction of the visible self that has been your primary interface with the world for as long as you can remember. It is still there. You cannot manage it away. You cannot outrun it, or outperform it, or outgrow it. It is the thing that keeps the door open. It is the thing that brought you here. It is the thing that kept you listening when the easier choice was to stop. And it is asking something of you, not a decision, not a change, just a question. One you are not quite ready to answer yet. But you have heard it, and the hearing is not nothing. There is something that happens in the last moment before a person finally stops running. Not a collapse, not a giving up in any defeated sense, just a stopping. A simple, quiet, honest stopping. The kind where the feet no longer carry you forward because something deeper than the feet has decided, without drama, that this is the place. That there is no more useful distance to put between yourself and what you've been moving away from. That the running itself, which began as protection and became habit and then became identity, has finally asked more than it can give back. You are in that stopping now, not because you were forced here, not because something broke or failed or fell apart in any visible way. but because something in you chose, quietly and without announcement, to stop choosing the distance. And that choice, so small from the outside, so enormous from the inside, is the one that nothing external can either give you or take away from you. It belongs entirely to you. In a life where so much has been shaped by external forces, by what was expected and what was rewarded and what was safe, this is one of the few things that came from somewhere entirely your own. I want to talk about what happens after a long stopping, after the body and the mind and the whole constructed architecture of the managed self finally holds still long enough for the deeper thing to come fully forward. It is not what you expect. It is not a wave of emotion or a sudden clarity or a voice that finally says the thing you have been waiting to hear. It is quieter than all of those things. It is almost unremarkable in its simplicity. It is just the feeling of being present, fully present, not thinking about what comes next or what should have been different, not reviewing the past or planning the future or monitoring yourself from a safe and managed distance. Just here, just now, just this. Most people have had this feeling only in very specific and often unexpected circumstances. In the first moments after something has ended, a relationship, a chapter of life, something that held enormous weight, and then was suddenly gone. In the still space after something has frightened them deeply, and the fear has passed, and they are still alive, and the world is still there and quiet. In rare, unguarded moments of genuine human contact, when the performance fell away for just a second, and something real passed between people without either of them having to try. In those moments, the familiar noise stops, and what is underneath the noise is simply this: presence. The actual, unmediated, unhurried experience of being alive in a particular moment without any layer between you and it, without any translation happening, without any management standing between the moment and the person receiving it. This is not a mystical thing. The mind is quick to categorize what it does not fully recognize, and once something is categorized as unusual or outside the normal range of practical experience, it gets filed away as not quite useful, not quite relevant to the real work of life. But presence is the most practical thing there is. Because this actual being inside your own life, rather than managing it from a slight and careful distance, is the only place from which anything genuinely yours can come. Every real decision, every honest connection, every act that carries actual weight, every moment that you will remember at the end of your life as having been truly lived, all of it comes from here. From this simple, quiet, enormously difficult state of being fully present inside your own experience, rather than observing it from behind the glass of constant self-management. And yet it is the thing most people spend most of their lives moving away from. Not because they know they are avoiding it, but because presence requires a kind of vulnerability that is almost impossible to appreciate until you have actually been inside it without the armor. Being fully present means being fully available to what is actually happening. And that means you are not protected. You cannot be present and defended at the same time. The openness that makes presence possible is the same openness that makes being hurt possible. And the mind, which is a very practical and loyal guardian, reads that equation and makes a simple choice. It chooses the management. It chooses the slight distance. It chooses the performance. Because those things keep the vulnerability at a manageable level, even when they keep the actual living at a manageable level too. Even when they make the life smaller than it needs to be. You have made a different choice today. Not permanently, not in any grand declarative sense, just in this moment, in this quiet and private hour that nobody else will know happened. You chose to be inside something real, without the full armor of your usual self-management. And that is not nothing. In the only measure that actually matters, the interior one, the one only you can access, this is something significant. Something that does not need an audience. Something that does not require validation to be real. Here's what I know about the kind of person who arrives at this moment, who sits inside this kind of honest stillness and does not flinch away from it even when it offers no resolution, even when it asks more than it gives in any immediate sense. This kind of person is not rare because they are special in any way that can be measured or compared to other people. They are rare because they are willing to feel what is actually there rather than what is easier to feel. Willing to stay inside the unfinished thing rather than forcing a conclusion that makes the discomfort stop. Willing to be incomplete without the incompleteness becoming their identity. That willingness is not something you are born with. It is built, slowly and quietly, through every moment where you chose honesty over comfort, depth over surface, presence over the performance of presence. Every time you made that choice, and you have made it, even if you did not always name it as a choice, something was built in you. Not visible, not measurable, but real, in the way that the most important things always are. The interior capacity for this kind of honest stillness does not come from nowhere. It is made of all those quiet choices, all those moments when you stayed inside the difficult thing a little longer than felt comfortable, all those times the noise did not win completely, all those private hours when you were more honest with yourself than the situation required. And now here you are, inside one of the most honest hours you have allowed yourself in a very long time. And what made it possible is not something that happened today. It is something built in you over a long and often very difficult time, through experiences you would never have chosen, and losses you would never have wanted, and silences you were not ready for but survived anyway. You are still carrying what you arrived with, the unnamed thing, the gap between interior life and visible life, the quiet and persistent ache for something more honest than the surface has ever been able to provide. None of that has been resolved. None of it was ever going to be resolved in a single hour of honest reflection, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The world will still be exactly what it was when you walk back into it. The demands will still be there. The noise will still be there. The familiar pressure to maintain the surface and be the version of yourself that the world has learned to expect, all of that will return, because it always does. There is no version of this that ends in permanent quiet. There is no single honest hour that rewrites the whole architecture of a life. But something has shifted. Something that is not a conclusion and not an answer and not a plan, but that is real in the way only interior things are fully real. Something about the quality of how you will carry what you carry going forward. Slightly more known, slightly more honestly held, slightly more yours, because you looked at it directly rather than managing it from a safe remove. That difference is small from the outside. From the inside, it slowly and quietly changes the weight of everything. The 1 minute before everything changes, you have been inside that minute for this entire time. And the thing about that minute, the thing that makes it unlike all the other minutes in a day, is not what happens after it. It is what becomes possible inside it. The thing that becomes available when a person finally, quietly, honestly stops. When the noise goes quiet without being forced. When the depth is allowed to be what it is without being immediately converted into something useful. When you sit inside the truth of your own interior without the immediate reach for something to do with it, something to make from it, some way to justify the time spent inside it. That possibility is still open, right now, in this breath, in this particular silence. The question living in you, the one you have not answered, the one you may not be ready to answer for a long time still, it has not disappeared. It is still there, exactly where it was when this began. Quiet, patient, not demanding anything, not growing louder, not threatening anything, just waiting. The way it has always waited, the way it will continue to wait, for however long is needed, without losing its quality, without becoming bitter, without closing. And you are still here with it, right here, not looking away. That is where this ends, not with the door closing, not with anything being decided or resolved or concluded, not with the comfortable feeling that something has been finished, just with you and the question and the rare and quietly significant fact of having stayed inside the truth long enough for it to actually reach you. For once, not looking away.